Although people in Venezuela have always protested to demand the protection of their rights, on February 12, 2014, protests began that until then had no precedent in the country. Like never before, Venezuelans, tired of the dramatic deterioration of the quality of life in the country, took to the streets to protest against the Maduro regime. People demanded improvements in the quality of education, health services, and working conditions. They were also protesting against the lack of independence of the justice system. Provea, a Venezuelan NGO, estimated that at least 800,000 people participated in the protests between February and late March 2014. Their extent and duration set a precedent, which was only surpassed by the 2017 protests. In this scenario of manifestations, the response of the Maduro regime was repression and violence. Hundreds of protesters were injured or killed by the misuse of force by members of the Venezuelan National Guard, an institution that is part of the National Bolivarian Armed Forces. In addition, human rights violations extended to people who did not participate in the protests. This was the case of Moisés Guanchez, a young Venezuelan who, despite having stayed away from the protests, on March 5, 2014, ended up suffering serious injuries at the hands of the National Guard.
Well, of those who are injured, there is one with a gunshot wound to the thigh and a pellet at the level of the lung, and another boy also with pellet wounds.
Welcome to Ausencias Forzadas, Forced Absences in English, a podcast by the International Commission of Jurists about the gaps and absences left by human rights violations in Latin America and the obstacles that victims and their families have faced to prevent such violations from remaining unpunished. I am Javier Vasconcelos, and on today's episode, I will tell you about the case of Moisés Guanchez. Let's begin. Moisés Guanchez was born in Caracas, Venezuela, but in 2014, the year when the events described here took place, he was living in the city of Los Teques, the capital of the Miranda state, located 25 kilometers away from Caracas, the country's capital. He was only 19 years old at the time. Moisés was always passionate about gastronomy, so he worked as a chef at Sabores, a Mexican restaurant located in the food court of one of the main shopping centers in the Carrizal municipality, La Cascada Shopping Center.
My life was normal. I mean, I can say I had a classic routine or the life of any young person at that time, a 19-year-old. I was working and studying for what is now my profession, a professional cook. It was just a normal life with my friends, my family, and my partner at that time. It was a pretty normal routine or life.
On the morning of Sunday, March the 5th, 2014, Moisés woke up and got ready to go to work. Although Moisés didn't know it, that day people had gone out to protest against Maduro's regime. It wasn't an exceptional protest. It was one of the many protests that took place at the beginning of that year throughout Venezuela. When Moisés left his house, he only noticed that the options for transportation were scarce, but he still managed to get to work. Upon arrival, he realized that it wasn't a normal day and that something was happening.
The truth is, when I got there, you could see on the road that it wasn't a normal day, that there had already been protests, that there were signs, that there had been some kind of protests, some kinds of riots in the area. There were burnt tires, pieces of barricades, things on the road.
Although his political stance was opposed to Maduro's regime and supported the demands of the demonstrations, he preferred not to go out because of fear of what he had seen on television during the last month of protests, the repression and hostility from the Bolivarian National Guard against the protesters, which resulted in arbitrary arrests, people being severely injured, and even some people dead. Without anticipating how much the situation would escalate, Moisés began his date inside the shopping center.
Las puertas del centro comercial estaban abiertas en ese momento.
The doors of the shopping center were open at that time, and I headed towards my work. I felt a bit strange. I don't know how to explain it. It was like a weird feeling, because everything was so empty. There was nothing there.
A su vez no había nada tampoco.
I mean, there was a disturbing silence in the air.
Ignoring these warning signs, Moisés opened the restaurant with his shift partner, prepared the cooking utensils, and got started. It was around 9 o'clock in the morning, and everything had returned to what was normal for a day of work for Moisés. However, an hour later, a noise broke the silence.
A las 10:10:15.
At around 10 or 10:15, I would say, we started hearing protests and what sounded like gunshots. At that moment, we didn't know what was happening, but we knew that they were gunshots. We heard the protests. My colleague and I went to the loading area of the shopping center to see what was happening.
Moisés and his colleague saw the National Guard was repressing a protest in the surrounding streets, so they decided to take refuge inside the restaurant.
We were there for, I would say, about only 20 or 30 minutes when we started to feel the smoke from the tear gas bombs. Because of my asthma, I couldn't tolerate it. My boss arrived and spoke with us and instructed us to go up to the office area, which was airtight. We took shelter there for a moment.
Moisés and his colleague remained calm for some time and were able to breathe better. But a while later, there was so much tear gas in the mall that it started to seep through the space between the office door and the floor.
It was already suffocating us inside the office, so we had to leave, close the entire store. We were inside the store and never participated in the protest, nor were we sympathizing with either the protesters or the guards. We always stayed on the inside of the mall, sheltered within the structure. And there was a lot of gas that was coming to us from outside where the protests were happening, which was about 250 meters away from where we were.
In the afternoon, the mall security ordered all employees and visitors to leave. Moisés and his colleague closed the store and arrived at the meeting point inside the mall with around 50 people, including women and children. They searched for an exit, but all were closed. At that moment, they met a mall guard who told them to go to the parking lot and wait there.
So we were seeing everything that was happening, and I called my mother and told her about the situation, that the National Guard was using shotguns, that they were throwing tear gas bombs. She asks if I'm safe. I tell her I am, but the situation is a bit difficult now. Then she tells me to stay where I am, that I will be safer there. So I tell her I'll keep her updated on everything that happens and that I'll try to find the safest way to get home on my own.
While Moisés was talking to his mother, he saw that from the street where several National Guard patrols were, some agents were pointing towards the parking lot where he was. As soon as he hung up, 2 National Guard motorcycles passed by, each with a driver and a passenger. For no apparent reason, they started firing towards the inside of the parking lot, through some bars that separated the shopping center from the street. They were firing pellets, Small rubber balls that hit at high speeds, one of the National Guard's preferred methods for suppressing protests. The use of pellets, although considered as non-lethal weapons, can cause serious injuries and even be deadly.
I threw myself to the ground. Many others ran towards the walls to seek shelter. However, we didn't have any protection because the parking lot was outdoors with no roof, walls, or anything except for the structures and columns. Therefore, we had nowhere to take cover.
The shots ceased, and there was complete uncertainty for 5 to 10 minutes. Everything seemed to have ended until more motorcyclists arrived at one of the closed entrances of the shopping center. The shots started again, and with them came the fear that invaded not only Moisés, but also everyone who was with him.
So, with all of this happening, everyone starts running. To my left, I had a pregnant woman. She ran to the left, and I ran to the right. Then a motorcycle comes and starts shooting at me. They shoot towards my face. I'm about 1 meter and 75 centimeters tall, and they shoot at the height of my face. They wanted to shoot me directly in the face. I cover myself with my left arm, and one of the pellets hits me in my forearm. I keep running, and a second motorcycle comes and starts shooting at me as well. The pellets hit my left buttock, and they try to block my path, and more motorcycles keep coming in. There were some National Guard officials there, not sure how many because there were so many motorcycles coming in, and they were trying to block me. Amidst all of this chaos, while running, I fall through one of the channels. There was a decorative flower plantation with the name of the mall, La Cascada, on one side. I try to run but stumble because it's not a normal walking or passing area. It's just for decoration. I fall, and then the National Guard surround me. Two of them lift me up, one on each side, hitting me in the rib area and taking me to the first guard who shot me. The same guard who tried to shoot me in the face. He was also the one who shot me in the buttocks. He pointed the gun at my testicles and fired. The shot was from less than 60 centimeters away. It was point blank. At that moment, I had the reflex to turn to the left, and it hit my leg, causing a wound that started to bleed. Immediately, they threw me on a motorcycle with one guard driving and another one getting on the back, pointing a firearm at my head and threatening to kill me if I moved.
No me importa matarte aquí mismo.
While pointing the gun at him, the National Guards ordered Moisés to put his hands over his head. At the same time, they tried to force the mall security staff to open the nearest door so they could take him away on the motorcycle. One of them was told they did not have permission to open the doors, so they took Moisés off the motorcycle and, despite his injuries, made him trot 20 meters to where there was an entrance, which they forced open to take him to the improvised operations center they had set up on the street. There, they handcuffed him and stood him in the street for about 15 minutes. Witnesses' photos show Moisés standing next to the National Guards and their patrols, with a thick stream of blood running down his light gray pants from his groin to his ankle. He was bleeding out.
This is extremely serious because a wounded person needs to be cared for at the moment that they are injured.
She is Maricel Gallardo, a medical doctor and oncology surgeon who treated several injured people during the protests at the Victorino Santaella Hospital in Los Teques.
The time between the injury and the transfer to the medical center and its immediate admission for immediate care is crucial, especially in the case of a bleeding wound. It is uncertain how much blood the patient will lose due to that wound. The vein they injured is a very important vein, the internal saphenous vein. It carries a huge amount of blood from the lower extremities, especially the legs.
When Moisés realized the amount of blood he was losing, he decided that it was best to stay still.
I don't try to escape. I don't try anything because I already had the leg injury. So in the midst of all this situation, I was thinking that if I started running, I could suffer even more damage. I didn't know how much damage I had in my leg and I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. I thought that if I moved too much, I could cause more damage. So I preferred to stay here. At least people can see me or see what is happening to me.
While he was standing there, the National Guards laughed at him. They made jokes, teased him, said he wouldn't be able to be a father or have sex anymore, and had fun watching him bleed. It was a party for them. Moisés had to listen to all of this while enduring the pain and feeling the blood running down his leg. Occasionally, he would rest his good leg to give the bleeding one a break. He breathed as he had learned to do to ease the asthma he had suffered from since childhood, which helped him to stay calm and pay attention to what the National Guards were saying in order to find clues on how to behave to avoid further mistreatment. After 15 minutes, the officer in charge arrived to ask his subordinates what had happened to the young man bleeding in the middle of the street and why he was in that condition. They came up with the response that Moisés had stumbled and hurt himself. The officer in charge then ordered them to take him to the hospital. 5 minutes later, still handcuffed, Moisés was riding in a van with 3 National Guards. The driver, the co-pilot, and the escort in the back seat.
The one in the back with me took my wallet, my cell phones, my chain, and the money I had on me. He was verbally abusive, saying that they were going to cut off my leg, that they knew people in the hospital who they were going to tell them to cut my leg off, that they were going to put a stick up my ass, that they were going to rape me.
Moisés remained silent. His mutism was his defense mechanism to survive and reach the hospital, but he had very little strength left. They still had about 2 kilometers to go, and he began to feel his eyelids drooping. He was gradually feeling drowsy, but had to fight this during the trip.
I already had that feeling, and the National Guard who was behind with me said, "If you fall asleep, we'll leave you lying in a ditch." So it was hearing those words, repeating to myself the word survive, and that's how I managed to get to the hospital.
They arrived at the Victorino Santaella Hospital. The National Guards took him out of the truck, and although the medical staff and stretcher bearers came forward to receive him, the guards pushed them aside and forced Moisés to trot once again to the minor surgery area, where he was received by the hands of Dr. Maricel Gallardo.
2 men were carrying the boy by his armpits. He was dragged to the minor surgery area. He was wearing white or light gray pants that were drenched in blood with a dark shirt. He was very pale, very distressed, and was unable to stand. We immediately lay him down on a stretcher. I told him, "We are going to undress you," and he said, "Do whatever you want, but relieve me of this pain and help me." help me. I said, of course, give me the information, give me a phone number. So we got all the information we needed to call his family. He never lost consciousness, but he was very distressed, very fearful, very frightened because the people who were carrying him as if he were a bale. That's not how you carry a human being.
When Dr. Gallardo examined Moisés's wounds and noticed the severity of the bleeding from his leg, she knew that taking him to the operating room was urgent. But she encountered an obstacle. The National Guards did not want to remove his handcuffs. They told the doctor that if she took him away, she would be kidnapping him.
I yelled when they told me that they weren't going to remove the handcuffs, that they didn't have the key to open them. I stood in the hallway, called the maintenance manager, and said, "Get me bolt cutters. I need to remove the patient's handcuffs." When I returned to where Moisés was, the one who was bringing him had already removed the handcuffs. That's not how you treat anyone, much less a young man who is injured.
What the uniformed guards of the National Guard wanted was for Moisés's wound to be simply sutured so that they could take him detained elsewhere. But the doctor was not going to let that happen, as she had already had to deal with similar cases and knew the risk of leaving him in the hands of the Bolivarian National Guard.
This has happened several times, more than once. I have told them, you can't take him away. The patient is in a delicate state. You can't take him out of the hospital. I need to take him to the operating room. And they just put them in a wheelchair, on a stretcher, and carry them out on their shoulders and take him out. Luckily, in Moisés's case, I was able to act quickly, put him on a stretcher, and I carried the stretcher with the stretcher bearer. When I walked by the National Guard officers, they said, "You're kidnapping him." And I answered, "Well, that's my problem." And I took him to the operating room. There was a case where I told them the patient needed to be evaluated by traumatology and asked the stretcher bearer to bring him back afterwards. But the officers took him away, and the young man turned up dead later. That wasn't going to happen again.
The doctor pulled Moisés out of the clutches of the National Guard and took him to the operating room. In the operating room, 5 pellets were removed from Moisés's wounds. His leg vein was operated on, and he received several blood transfusions as he had lost a lot of blood. In fact, when he arrived at the hospital, he was not bleeding as much as he was in the mall, as he slowly ran out of blood. Moisés woke up a little later. He never imagined his mother's face would be the first thing he saw.
I remember she started crying and said, "I'm here, son."
As soon as he was more stable, in the early hours of the next day, medical staff transferred him to a ward where he would rest until he was discharged. All of this brought Moisés more peace of mind. But that shred of peace did not last long. National Guard agents stalked him in the hospital corridors. They had him in detention, waiting to be presented before a judge. They still wanted to take him away. The confrontation between medical staff and the National Guard resumed, and Moisés's parents, who never left him alone, joined in. Armed National Guards were at the door of his room guarding it. Only medical personnel were allowed to enter. No friends or relatives who were not his parents were allowed. These days, Moisés says, felt extremely long. He could hardly rest. When the time came, a forensic doctor came to perform the necessary tests. According to his mother, the doctor behaved irregularly. He did not remove the bandage from the most severe wound in the groin, which could have killed him. This review was important because 2 days after the attack, Moisés, still being detained, had to face justice. Still detained in the hospital room, the flagrancy presentation hearing took place, in which a judge evaluated whether there was sufficient evidence to initiate legal proceedings against Moisés for allegedly committing crimes attributed to him by the National Guard. Without any evidence, the National Guard was accusing Moisés of stealing 2 motorcycles, having 30 meters of barbed wire, 19 Molotov cocktails, and 2 Miguelitos, which are metal spikes used to stop vehicles by puncturing their tires. They also said he had disobeyed the law, obstructed traffic, and disrupted public order.
No evidence was found on Moisés regarding what he was carrying at the time of his arrest, but rather at the time of the acting. It was stated that these items could have been supposedly used by him to turn the protest into a violent one. The truth is that this was something absolutely unsupported.
They tried to plant evidence throughout all of this. The judge listened to both sides and made a decision. Complete freedom for Moisés. The decision to release him surprised many because in Venezuela, the judicial independence has been minimal for several years. Judges don't make decisions based on what is right, but rather on what the powerful want. The judge surprised everyone by not only granting Moisés full freedom, but also by ordering an investigation against the officials who had taken part in the operation in which Moisés was mistreated.
I could finally breathe after those 3 days that felt like a lifetime. It was quite something to take a moment and be able to take a breath.
Moisés was released without charge on March 7, 2014, 2 days after the crime committed against him by the National Guard. He was finally able to be reunited with his loved ones. In the following months, Moisés underwent 2 more surgeries. The follow-up exams went well and concluded that he was not going to have any sequelae, complications, or permanent damage. However, to this day, Moisés sometimes makes movements that generate a lot of tension and cause pain in the leg where he was shot. He fears that over time, the pain may worsen. In addition to the physical consequences, Moisés has had to face the psychological aftermath of the attack by the National Guard. Paranoia, persecution, nightmares, and sleeping problems. These symptoms are experienced by people who have been victims of traumatic experiences.
I felt like I was being followed and watched all the time, and that feeling was really intense. Even now, after 9 years, I can sometimes feel it again, and it's a really distressing situation. I can't quite explain it, but it's a very, very bad sensation.
Despite the health sequels, Moisés wanted to return to his normal life, to work, be with his friends and family, and continue being the person he always was. He was just starting to recover from his 3rd surgery, which would allow him to stabilize his life, when he began receiving unexpected calls.
I started receiving calls from my coworkers, emails, and calls from the school I was attending. They were saying that the National Guard was leaving notifications for me at my work, which was in La Cascada Mall. They were leaving notifications, messages, stating that they wanted to talk to me. They were looking for me. They were taking pictures at different times. Everything was very strange, especially because they already had an open investigation for the damages and attacks that had been made against me. So all of this harassment and persecution against me was very strange.
Contra mío ya era un poco extraño.
In addition to showing up at Moisés' school and workplace, the National Guard was also following his boss, co-workers, and acquaintances. To protect them and avoid exposing them, Moisés decided to resign and distance himself from many people he preferred not to involve. At that point, the harassment and stalking against him intensified, affecting Moisés' mental health.
Era agarrar y estar en un estado constante de estrés.
I was in a constant state of paranoia and extreme stress, unable to be alone, unable to spend much time in one place, unable to continue with my studies, unable to meet peacefully with my friends. In fact, I couldn't even see or be seen by my partner, my best friends, or anyone else.
In order to see a few loved ones, Moisés and his family had to come up with a strategy to outsmart the National Guard. They spent a few days at his grandmother's house, then a few at his aunt's, and so on.
Pues mi día a día
So my day-to-day was literally being locked up, always looking out through a window, depending on where I was staying. I rarely used phones because there was also fear. I feared that they were listening to me, that the communication was being intercepted. It was really chaotic.
As Moisés was starting to get used to the intimidations, the prosecutor's office began investigations into the responsibility of the National Guard in the attack against Moisés. The National Guard did not collaborate in providing the information required by the prosecutor's office, and some of the evidence, such as the bloody clothes that Moisés was wearing and his work backpack. The National Guard took them, and their location was unknown. Of the 5 pellets extracted from Moisés' wounds, only 3 appear in the forensic medical examination report. From the beginning, the investigation was slow and marked by obstacles and gaps, so it would not advance for some time. Meanwhile, the National Guard continued to harass him. In November 2014, the situation reached a breaking point.
I was intercepted by a National Guard jeep, and 4 officials got out of their vehicle aiming at me. I was alone in my car and was going to pick up my grandmother when they confronted me. They forced me out of the car and made me lie face down on the ground. I heard them talking about killing me or leaving me stranded before leaving.
Al momento de que yo estoy
At that moment, 2 policemen from Polimiranda arrived on their motorcycles, and upon seeing them, the National Guard officials got back into their jeep and fled, leaving me lying on the ground. Fortunately, nothing happened to me.
dejándome a mí tirado en el suelo. Gracias a Dios no me pasó nada.
Moisés was saved by the fact that at that time he had protection from the police of the Miranda state, which passed by his home 3 or 4 times a day to check if he was okay. Moisés obtained this protection through the public ministry, which ordered it in his favor after he reported being harassed and pursued. After that incident, Moisés' lawyers, with the support of the Center for Human Rights of the Andrés Bello Catholic University, changed their strategy. The protection measures had to be stricter.
Tenía que estarme mudando de una casa a otra.
I had to keep moving from one house to another, so they couldn't locate me, so that they couldn't track me down. My family could not stay in contact, they couldn't call me, I didn't have mobile phones, I had no way of contact. I had nothing, just my backpack and my clothes.
Un carro afuera esperándome,
A car would wait outside for me. They would take me to a house where I would spend 7 or 8 hours, rest, sleep, watch TV. Then another car would arrive to pick me up and take me to another house. There, I would spend maybe 12 hours or a day, and then another car would come, and so on. This lasted a month and a few days, until my definitive departure from Venezuela was decided.
On January 17, 2015, after enduring sustained intimidation and feeling once again on the brink of death, Moisés went into exile alone, far from Venezuela and those who loved him, to a country whose name we will not reveal for discretion with him and his family. In his exodus, Moisés began a new life almost from scratch. He had to seek political asylum, find work, a home, new friends, chores, and learn a new language. During the adaptation period, he had support from organizations such as Amnesty International and the Human Rights Center of the Catholic University Andrés Bello, who supported him. A couple of years later, in 2017, having found stability and in the process of rebuilding his life, he was surprised by the news that the investigation of his case, which had taken 3 long years and was in the hands of the prosecution, had ended. One of the National Guard officers was going to be accused of the crimes committed against him. The officer was accused of illegitimately depriving him of his freedom, simulating a punishable act by trying to make the justice system believe that Moisés had committed illicit acts during the protests, improperly using a weapon against him, and subjecting him to cruel treatment. Due to the delays and irregularities of the case, it took another 5 years to see a glimpse of justice. In May 2022, the trial against the National Guard officer finally began. Jose Bernardo, Moisés' lawyer, explains how this delay continued to violate Moisés' rights.
Indeed, the delay in this process is a violation of the right to access to justice. If we examine comprehensively from the beginning, everything related to the identification of the people involved and the provision of corresponding evidence, one must consider that beyond what a legal system can establish internally in each country, there are international standards regarding due process. For example, notifications directed to the Guard and the response took too long, and this can be interpreted as a state policy aimed at obstructing access to justice. But the truth is, and this has also been a part of accusations at the international human rights institution level, that the independence of this judiciary has been very questioned. And this is partly related to this issue. For example, the trial lasted 8 years to finally be able to present arguments, present evidence, etc. at a hearing. That overtly exceeds reasonable time frames estimated for an access to justice in a trial.
Finally, on Monday, November 21st, 2022, after many delays, the hearing took place where the judge announced her verdict. Moisés' lawyers say they had all the necessary evidence and testimonies for the judge to issue a conviction. Moisés, who participated in the trial virtually, pointed out that the accused guard was his attacker and had no doubt that it was him. Despite this, the judge ruled that the National Guard was innocent and therefore was released. Jose Bernardo explains the defense strategy of the accused guard to achieve a declaration of innocence.
There is no doubt about the violation of human rights here. What is being discussed, at least as presented by the defense, is that they consider that the person being accused was not the one who fired the shot. The defense presented this argument as their main point, that the accused actually had a very specific role in transporting Moisés to Victorino Santaella Hospital, but that he had no part in the events inside La Cascada shopping center.
On the day of the attack against Moisés, the accused signed a document certifying his presence at the scene of the crime. However, during the trial, his defense claimed that he had only signed it under pressure and that he had never been there. The judge accepted these arguments, and now the guard walks freely on the streets of Venezuela. Despite all of this, Moisés has remained steadfast in his fight, hoping that no one else will have to go through what he did.
As the years have passed, and everything that has happened, my way of thinking has also changed. I no longer seek or want justice for my case or for myself. I want it to not happen again. This must be an example so that measures can be taken to prevent it from happening again. Only then I would know there is a change, an answer, and I would stop fighting because this situation would not repeat itself.
Although there is no concrete evidence, given the context of Venezuela, there is a certain probability that the judge in Moisés's case did not act independently. According to the Independent Mission for the Determination of the Facts on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela and reports from the International Commission of Jurists, the judiciary in Venezuela is neither impartial nor independent. The majority of judges are appointed by hand and can be dismissed without reason and without respecting the process outlined in the Constitution. Additionally, it is common for them to face pressure to rule in a certain way, particularly in cases of political nature or that could have negative consequences for the regime. However, despite how difficult it is for victims to trust the national judicial system, Moisés and his lawyers appealed the decision and are waiting to see if the appeals court will rectify what they see as a serious error by the lower court. Moisés does not rule out going even further and submitting his case to international justice if circumstances require it.
I have spoken with my lawyers and told them that, if necessary, my case could be used openly and publicly, because the damage, not only psychological, but physical, that has been caused to me and my family has already been done. What I ask for is that this doesn't happen to any other family or person.
Nowadays, although Moisés misses Venezuela and would like to return, he is determined to rebuild his life. At first, hatred and resentment towards the National Guard paralyzed him and didn't allow him to move on. But now, although he can't say he has forgiven them, he feels different.
All of those feelings would take me to a state where there would be no progress. I would be stuck in the past, in that toxic resentment where I would be consumed, and there would be no change.
In recent years, Moisés has continued to train to achieve his dream of becoming a chef. And although he is not currently practicing his desired career, he has a project to apply it in a way that helps those in need.
I'm working on a project to create a social dining room where I can collaborate and contribute to those in need. Not only asylum seekers, refugees, or people who are persecuted or violated, but also people with low resources or in need.
In spite of all the pain and trauma, it is perhaps that sense of community and love for life that has marked Moisés since the National Guard attacked him.
recuerdo y enseñanza que he vivido.
What I have learned during these last 9 years is that you really have to love and enjoy every day. The people that you spend your time with whom one lives, with whom one can talk, always have something interesting, positive to say. It's about looking for the positive side of things, no matter how bad, how complicated, how difficult they may be.
Que sean, siempre estar bien con uno mismo.
Always be well with oneself, and always look for what to do and enjoy every day. Enjoy every day.
No como si fuese el último, pero
Not as if it were the last, but enjoy it as the only one that there is.
disfrutar el día como el único que es.
So that cases like that of Moisés Guanchez do not happen again, the International Commission of Jurists considers it fundamental that the justice system investigate, judge, and sanction those who have committed serious violations of human rights independently, impartially, and effectively. Similarly, Venezuelan authorities must guarantee the exercise of the right to protest. To do so, measures must be taken to ensure that the use of force respects international standards of human rights, which determine that the use of force must be exceptional, necessary, and proportionate. Finally, it is also essential that military bodies such as the National Guard do not exercise public order functions, since they are not trained or designed to guarantee the protection and control of civilians in the context of social protests or situations of public disorder. Forced Absences is a podcast created by the International Commission of Jurists. This episode featured the participation of Moisés Guanchez. We deeply thank him for sharing his memories and for his trust. The testimonies and information shared by José Bernardo Guevara and Alba Martínez, lawyers of Moisés Guanchez, and by Dr. Maricel Gallardo, who treated him on the day of the attack, helped us construct the narrative of this episode. We thank them for their stories. And also to the Human Rights Center of the Andrés Bello Catholic University. Thank you for the archival elements that were used to set the tone for the narration. The journalistic work of this podcast and its sound design were done by La No Ficción Agency. My name is Javier Vasconcelos, and I thank you for joining us on Ausencias Forzadas, Forced Absences in English.